After a long day of hunting and packing, the triumphant hunters Thomas and George returned to their little cabin in the wilderness to celebrate the successful day. The two hunters had just shot an elk, and wanted to celebrate that evening by having dinner and a couple of beers together around the campfire. During that evening the full moon was shining bright, and the sounds of bugling elk could be heard in the distance. At around midnight George retired back to his bunk in the cabin, and Thomas remained outside around the campfire eating his late-night dinner. He could still hear the sounds of bugling elk in the distance. Then, out of nowhere, he could hear howling in the distance, but it wasn't like any kind of howling noise that he had ever heard in his life. Thomas raced back into the cabin to awaken George, who was dead asleep in his bunk. George woke up and listened but heard nothing. Whatever that made that howling noise had stopped. George went back to bed and convinced Thomas to also go to bed in his bunk. Later that night, Thomas woke up because he had to use the restroom, so he walked out of the cabin with his flashlight and towards the outhouse that was around 30 yards away from the cabin. After taking care of his business, Thomas walked out of the outhouse and proceeded along the trail towards the cabin. While walking, Thomas heard a twig snap about 40 feet in front of him. He quickly shined his flashlight in the direction of where he heard the twig snap. He saw something move behind a tree, but wasn't sure what it was because whatever it was swift. Thomas then walked towards the tree where he saw movement and shined his flashlight at the tree. Then he saw it. He saw whatever it was walk out from behind the tree and into the middle of the trail about 10 feet in front of him. Thomas panicked, dropped his flashlight, and ran as fast as he could back to the outhouse and locked the door. Thomas heard whatever it was circle the cabin twice, and then circle the outhouse twice, and then walk back into the woods. Whatever it was, he wasn't convinced that it was completely gone, so he spent the night in the outhouse that night. Then, as soon as it got light enough outside, Thomas ran out of the outhouse as fast as he could, and then back to the cabin. He immediately woke up George and told him everything that had happened that night. George didn't believe him and thought he was telling a lie, so Thomas showed him the spot in the trail where the incident took place and found large footprints on the trail. George still didn't believe Thomas and thought he was pranking him, so he decided to go back to bed. Thomas felt determined to find whatever it was he saw last night, so he grabbed his rifle and decided to follow the creature's footprints into the woods. Thomas followed the creature's footprints for about 2 miles until he could no longer find any more footprints. He then decided to go back to the cabin. When he arrived back to the cabin, what he found terrified him. The cabin was destroyed in the inside. Food was all over the ground. The cabinets were ripped out of the shelves, and George's dead body lay on the ground of the living room with his neck snapped. Thomas realized that whatever it was that was out there didn't want him around, and he was saying, "Get out of my territory." So Thomas grabbed everything that he could and raced 6 miles as fast as he could back to the beach where his and George's skiff was at, so he could skiff back to town. About 2 hours 2 hours later of fast-paced hiking, Thomas finally reached the beach where the skiff was at. As he was pulling off the beach in the skiff, he looked behind him and saw the creature that he had encountered the night before on the edge of the tree line of the beach. Thomas cranked up the motors and got out of there as fast as the skiff could go. About 2 hours later, he finally reached town and told the game warden everything that had happened. The game warden was discouraged and gathered up a team of wardens and headed back to the scene of the crime in their agency's skiff. When they reached the cabin, they found a destroyed cabin, but were unable to find the body of George. They did, however, find footprints of whatever was at the cabin.